Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome in. Thank you for your patience today. I had a lot of stuff I was getting done, like cleaning my house and cooking and doing laundry and, adulting. Hello, Bryant Conway. Appreciate the lurks. Welcome in, Chart Darby. How is the Central Time Zone treating you? And welcome in, Frankie and Gray, legendary science comrade of light. I did get to play just a little today. I did gold saucer stuff while I was cleaning. Back to reality. Oh, Elliot. Wait, audio streams current. What? I just started. What could you possibly have to complain about? Lower. Oh no. Oh no. Have I already lost you? It said. Huh. It says that I don't have a bitrate. Do not tell me my internet is dying. Can you hear me? Is all well? Can't lose us, you live here. Okay, so you are hearing me then. That's good. You hear your Hoshi? You stop that. All right. The hotel your job paid for is so bougie. That's awesome. Yeah, Chicago's got some interesting hotels. I've done a color run both there and St. Louis. And the one that we stayed in for Chicago was pretty cool. All right. Well, I do believe we have some Edgar Allan Poe reading to do. I will do what I can. I may have blown my voice out last night watching a drag show, but right now it's fine. So let's see how long it stays fine. All right. So our first story today, if I could get my reading light down here. Hell yeah. Oh, it was so fun. It was so fun. I got a bag of Fritos forcibly stuffed into my lap because I gave someone $1. And then I got a thing of cosmic brownies after because he still had extra. It was so funny. That was my dinner last night. I had a total girl dinner last night of Fritos and cosmic brownie. But it's okay because I had a buffet before I streamed Dark Souls. It was fine. Okay. More to come on that. I might not be needed Tuesday. If I am not needed Tuesday, then I will be here. Monday and Wednesday are even bigger toss-ups, but I will keep you informed. Welcome in, Dr. Frederick. You caught me right before I start to talk. Well, not talk, read. Glad to have you. And glad to have you too, Bryant. Hello. All right, shall we begin? I think we should begin. A descent into the maelstrom. We begin with a preface. The ways of God in nature, as in providence, are not as our ways, nor are the models that we frame in any way commensurate to the vastness, profundity, and unsearchableness of his works, which have a depth in them greater than the well of Democritus. Joseph Glanville. My mic is very high. One moment. Adjust. We had now reached the summit of the loftiest crag. For some minutes the old man seemed too much exhausted to speak. Not long ago, said he at length, and I could have guided you on this route as well as the youngest of my sons, but about 3 years past there happened to me an event such as never happened before to mortal men, or at least such as no man ever survived to tell of. And the 6 hours of deadly terror which I then endured have broken me up body and soul. You suppose me a very old man, but I am not. It took less than a day to change these hairs from a jetty black to white, to weaken my limbs and to unstring my nerves so that I tremble at the least exertion and am frightened at a shadow. Did you know I can scarcely look over this little cliff without getting giddy? The little cliff, upon whose edge he had so carelessly thrown himself down to rest that the weightier portion of his body hung over it, while he was only kept from falling by the tenure of his elbow upon its extreme and slippery edge. This little cliff arose, a sheer, unobstructed precipice of black, shining rock, some 1,500 or 1,600 feet from the world of crags below us. Nothing would have tempted me to be within half a dozen yards of its brink. In truth, so deeply was I excited by the perilous position of my companion that I fell at full length upon the ground, clung to the shrubs around me, and dared not even glance upward at the sky. while I struggled in vain to divest myself of the idea that the foundations of the mountain were in danger from the fury of the winds. It was long before I could reason myself into sufficient courage to sit up and look out into the distance. "You must get over these fancies," said the guide, "for I have brought you here that you might have the best possible view of that scene of the event which I mentioned, and to tell you the whole story with the spot just under your eye." "We are now," he continued in that particularizing manner which distinguished him, "we are now upon the Norwegian coast, in the 68th link of latitude, in the great province of Nordland, and in the dreary district of Lofeden. The mountain upon whose top we sit is Helseggen, the Cloudy. Now raise yourself up a little higher. Hold on to the grass if you feel giddy. So, and look out beyond the belt of vapor beneath us into the sea." I looked dizzily and beheld a wide expanse of ocean, whose waters wore so inky a hue as to bring at once to my mind the Nubian geographer's account of the Mare Tenebrarum, a panorama more deplorably desolate no human imagination can conceive. To the right and left, as far as the eye could reach, there lay outstretched like ramparts of the world lines of horridly black and beetling cliff, whose character of gloom was but the more forcibly illustrated by the surf which reared high up against its white and ghastly crest, howling and shrieking forever. Just opposite the promontory upon whose apex we were placed, and at a distance of some 5 or 6 miles out to sea, there was visible a small bleak-looking island, or, more properly, its position was discernible through the wilderness of surge in which it was enveloped. About 2 miles nearer the land arose another of smaller size, hideously craggy and barren, and encompassed at various intervals by a cluster of dark rocks. The appearance of the ocean in the space between the more distant island and the shore had something very unusual about it. Although at the time so strong a gale was blowing landward that a brig in their remote offing lay to under a double-reefed trysail, and constantly plunged her whole hull out of sight, still there was nothing here like a regular swell, but only a short, quick, angry cross-dashing of water in every direction, as well as the teeth of the wind as otherwise. Of foam there was little except in the immediate vicinity of the rocks. "The island in the distance," resumed the old man, "is called by the Norwegian Vurg. The one midway is Moskoe. Then a mile to the northward is Ambaren. Yonder are Eilsen, Holtham, Hindhelm, Swarven, and Buckholm. Further off, between Moskoe and Vurg, are Otterholm, Flimmen, Sandflissen, and Stockholm. These are the true names of the places. But why it has been thought necessary to name them at all is more than either you or I can understand. Do you hear anything? Do you see about any change in the water?" We had now been about 10 minutes upon the top of Helseggen, to which we had ascended from the interior of Lofeden, so that we may catch no glimpse of the sea until it had burst forth upon us from the summit. As the old man spoke, I became aware of a loud and gradually increasing sound like the moaning of a vast herd of buffaloes upon an American prairie, and at the same moment I perceived that what seamen termed the chopping character of the ocean beneath us was rapidly changing into a current which set to the eastward. Even while I gazed, this current acquired a monstrous velocity. Each moment added to its speed, to its headlong impetuosity. In 5 minutes, the whole sea as far as Vurg was lashed into ungovernable fury, but it was between Moskoe and the coast that the main uproar held its sway. Here the vast bed of the waters, seamed and scarred into 1,000 conflicting channels, burst suddenly into frenzied convulsion, heaving, boiling, hissing, gyrating in gigantic and innumerable vortices, and all whirling and plunging on to the eastward with a rapidity which water never elsewhere assumes except in precipitous descents. In a few moments more there came over the scene another radical alteration. The general surface grew somewhat more smooth, and the whirlpools one by one disappeared, while prodigious streaks of foam became apparent where none had been seen before. These streaks at length, spreading out to a great distance, and entering into combination took unto themselves the gyratory motion of the subsidied vortices, and seemed to form the germ of another more vast. Suddenly, very suddenly, this assumed a distinct and definite existence in a circle of more than a mile in diameter. The edge of the whirl was represented by a broad belt of gleaming spray, but no particle of this slipped into the mouth of the terrific funnel, whose interior, as far as the eye could fathom it, was a smooth, shining, and jet-black wall of water, inclined to the horizon at an angle of some 45 degrees, speeding dizzily round and round with a swaying and sweltering motion, and sending forth to the winds an appalling voice, half shriek, half roar, such as not even the mighty cataract of Niagara ever lifts up into its agony to heaven. The mountain trembled to its very base, and the rock rocked. I threw myself upon my face and clung to the scant herbage in an excess of nervous agitation. "This," said I at length to the old man, "this can be nothing else than the great whirlpool of the maelstrom." "So it is sometimes termed," said he. "We Norwegians call it the Moskostrom, from the island of Moscow in the Midway." The ordinary accounts of this vortex had by no means prepared me for what I saw. That of Jonas Ramus, which is perhaps the most circumstantial of any, cannot impart the faintest conception either of the magnificence or of the horror of the scene, or of the wild, bewildering sense of the novel which confounds the beholder. I am not sure from what point of view the writer in question surveyed it, nor at what time, but it could neither have been from the summit of Helseggen nor during a storm. There are some passages of his description, nevertheless, which may be quoted for their details, although their effect is exceedingly feeble in conveying an impression of the spectacle. "Between Lofoten and Moscow," says he, "the depth of the water is between 36 and 40 fathoms. But on the other side, towards Vurrgh, this depth decreases so as to not afford a convenient passage for a vessel without the risk of splitting upon the rocks, which happens even in the calmest weather. When it is in flood, the stream runs up the country between Lofoten and Moscow with a boisterous rapidity, but the roar of its impetuous ebb to the sea is scarce equalled by the loudest and most dreadful cataracts, the noise being heard several leagues off, and the vortices or pits are of such an extent and depth that if a ship comes within its attraction it is inevitably absorbed and carried down to the bottom, and there beat to pieces against the rocks. And when the water relaxes, the fragments thereof are thrown up again. But these intervals of tranquillity are only at the turn of the ebb and flood, and in calm weather, and last but a quarter of an hour, its violence gradually returning. When the stream is most boisterous and its fury heightened by a storm, it is dangerous to come within Norway mile of it. Boats, yachts, and ships have been carried away by not guarding against it before they were within its reach. It likewise happens frequently that whales come too near the stream, and are overpowered by its violence, and that it is impossible to describe their howlings and bellowings and their fruitless struggles to disengage themselves. A bear, once attempting to swim from Lofoten to Moscow, was caught by the stream and borne down while he roared terribly so as to be heard on shore. Large stalks of firs and pine trees, after being absorbed by the current, rise again broken and torn to such a degree as if bristles grew upon them. This plainly shows the bottom to consist of craggy rocks, among which they are whirled to and fro. The stream is regulated by the flux and reflux of the sea, it being constantly high and low water every 6 hours. In the year 1645, early in the morning of Sexagesima Sunday, it raged with such noise and impetuosity that the very stones of the houses on the coast fell to the ground. In regards to the depths of the water, I could not see how this could have been ascertained at all in the immediate vicinity of the vortex. The 40 fathoms must have reference only to portions of the channel close upon the shore either of Moscow or Lofoten. The depth in the center of the Moskostrom must be immeasurably greater, and no better proof of this fact is necessary than can be obtained from even the sidelong glance into the abyss of the whirl, which may have been had from the highest crag of Helseggen. Looking down from this pinnacle upon the howling phlegethon below, I could not help smiling at the simplicity with which the honest Jonas Ramus records, as a matter of difficult belief, the anecdotes of the whales and the bears, for it appeared to me, in fact, a self-evident thing that the largest ships of the line in existence, coming within the influence of that deadly attraction, could resist it as little as a feather the hurricane, and must disappear bodily and at once. The attempts to account for the phenomenon, some of which I remember, seemed to me sufficiently plausible in perusal, now wore a very different and unsatisfactory aspect. The idea generally received is that this, as well as 3 smaller vortices among the Faroe Islands, have no other cause than the collision of waves rising and falling at flux and reflux against a ridge of rocks and shelves which confines the water so that it precipitates itself like a cataract, and thus the higher the flood rises, the deeper must be the fall. And the natural result of all is a whirlpool or vortex, the prodigious suction of which is sufficiently known by lesser experiments. These are the words of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Kircher and others imagine that the center of the channel of the maelstrom is an abyss penetrating the globe, and issuing in some very remote part the Gulf of Bothnia, being somewhat decidedly named in that one instance. This opinion, idle in itself, was the one to which, as I gazed, my imagination most readily assented, and mentioning it to the guide, I was rather surprised to hear him say that, although it was the view almost universally entertained of the subject of the Norwegians, it nevertheless was not his own. As to the former notion, he confessed his inability to comprehend it, and here I agreed with him, for however conclusive on paper, it becomes altogether unintelligible, and even absurd amid the thunder of the abyss. "You have had a good look at the whirl now," said the old man, "and if you will creep round this crag, so as to get in its lee and deaden the roar of the water, I will tell you a story that will convince you I ought to know something of the Moskostrom." I placed myself as desired, and he proceeded. "Myself and my 2 brothers once owned a schooner rig, smack of about 70 tons burden, with which we were in the habit of fishing among the islands beyond Moscow, nearly to Vurg. In all violent eddies at sea there is good fishing, at proper opportunities, if one only has the courage to attempt it. But among the whole of the Lofoden coastmen, we 3 were the only ones who made a regular business of going out to the islands, as I tell you. The usual grounds are a great way lower to the southward. There fish can be got at all hours, without much risk, and therefore these places are preferred. The choice spots over here among the rocks, however, not only yield the finest variety, but in far greater abundance, so that we often got in a single day what the more timid of the craft could not scrape together in a week. In fact, we made it a matter of desperate speculation, the risk of life standing instead of labor, and courage answering for capital. We kept the smack in a cove about 5 miles higher up the coast than this, and it was our practice in fine weather to take advantage of the 15 minutes slack to push across the main channel of the Moskostrom, far above the pool, and then drop down upon anchorage somewhere near Otterholm, or Sandflesen, where the eddies are not so violent as elsewhere. Here we used to remain until nearly time for slack water again, when we weighed and made for home. We never set out upon this expedition without a safety side wind, for going and coming, one that we felt sure would not fail us before our return, and we seldom made a miscalculation upon this part. Twice during 6 years we were forced to stay all night at anchor on account of a dead calm, which is a rare thing indeed just about here, and once we had to remain upon the grounds nearly a week, starving to death owing to a gale which blew up shortly after our arrival, and made the channel too boisterous to be thought of. Upon this occasion we should have been driven out to sea in spite of everything, for the whirlpools threw us round and round so violently that at length we fouled our anchor and dragged it, if it had not been that we drifted into one of the innumerable cross-currents, here today and gone tomorrow, which drove us under the lee of Flemmen, where by good luck we brought up. Water break. Welcome in, Silent Owl. Thank you so much for the follow. We try to do this every Sunday if I'm feeling up to it. Welcome in, Bubba and Reeb, and Dr. Frederick is still here, and I still don't remember how to say your name. I'm sorry. PSS 674. I know you told me, but it's been a while. This one manages to capture the sheer impersonal dread of massive natural phenomena. As someone who lives in Tornado Alley and frequently gets straight line winds and derechos, yeah, I feel that. All right. I could not tell you in the 20th part of the difficulties we encountered on the grounds. It is a bad spot to be in, even in good weather, but we made shift always to run the gauntlet of the Moskostrom itself without incident. although at times my heart has been in my mouth when we happen to be a minute or so behind or before the slack. The wind sometimes was not as strong as we thought it at starting, and then we made rather less way than we could wish, while the current rendered the smack unmanageable. My eldest brother had a son 18 years old, and I had 2 stout boys of my own. These would have been of great assistance at such times in using the sweeps as well as afterward in fishing, but somehow, although we ran the risk ourselves, we had not the heart to let the young ones get into the danger. For, after all is said and done, it was horrible danger, and that is the truth. It is now within a few days of 3 years since what I am going to tell you occurred. It was on the 10th day of July, 18 blank. A day which the people of this part of the world will never forget, for it was one in which blew the most terrible hurricane that ever came out of the heavens. And yet, all the morning, and indeed until late afternoon, there was a gentle and steady breeze from the southwest while the sun shone brightly, so that the oldest seaman among us could not have foreseen what was to follow. The 3 of us, my 2 brothers and myself, had crossed over to the islands about 2:00 p.m., and had soon nearly loaded the smack with fine fish, which, we all remarked, were more plenty that day than we had ever known them. It was just 7 by my watch, when we weighed and started for home so as to make the worst of the storm at slack water, which we knew would be 8. We set out with a fresh wind on our starboard quarter, and for some time spanked along at a great rate, never dreaming of danger, for indeed we saw not the slightest reason to apprehend it. All at once we were taken aback by a breeze from over Helseggen. This was most unusual, something that had never happened to us before, and I began to feel a little uneasy without knowing exactly why. We put the boat on the wind, but could make no headway at all for the eddies, and I was upon the point of proposing to return to the anchorage when, looking astern, we saw the whole horizon covered with a singular copper-colored cloud that rose with the most amazing velocity. In the meantime, the breeze that had headed us off fell away, and we were dead becalmed, drifting about in every direction. This state of things, however, did not last long enough to give us time to think about it. In less than a minute, the storm was upon us. In less than 2, the sky was entirely overcast, and what with this and the driving spray, it became so suddenly dark that we could not see each other in the smack. Such a hurricane as then blew, it is folly to attempt describing. The oldest seaman in Norway never experienced anything like it. We had let our sails go by the run before it cleverly took us, but at the first puff both of our masts went by the board as if they had been sawed off, the main mast taking with it my youngest brother, who had lashed himself to it for safety. Our boat was the lightest feather of a thing that ever sat upon the water. It had a complete flush deck with only a small hatch near the bow, and this hatch it had always been our custom to batten down when about to cross the Strom, by way of precaution against the chopping sea. But for this circumstance we should have foundered at once, for we lay entirely buried for some moments. How my elder brother escaped destruction I cannot say, for I have never had an opportunity of ascertaining. For my part, as soon as I had let the foresail run, I threw myself upon the deck with my feet against the narrow gunwale of the bow, and my hands grasping a ring-bolt near the foot of the foremast. It was mere instinct that prompted me to do this, which was undoubtedly the very best thing I could have done, for I was much too flurried to think. For some moments we were completely deluged, and as I say, all this time I held my breath and clung to the bolt. When I could stand it no longer, I raised myself upon my knees, still keeping hold with my hands, and thus got my head clear. Presently our little boat gave herself a shake, just as a dog does in coming out of the water, and thus rid herself in some measure of the sea. I was now trying to get the better of the stupor that had come over me, and to collect my senses so as to see what was to be done, when I felt somebody grasp my arm. It was my older brother, and I leaped for joy, for I had made sure that he was overboard. But the next moment all this joy was turned to horror, for he put his mouth close to my ear and screamed out the word, "Moskostrom." No one will ever know what my feelings were at that moment. I shook from head to foot as if I had the most violent fit of the ague. I knew what he meant by that one word well enough. I knew what he wished to make me understand. With the wind that now drove us on, we were bound for the whirl of the Strom, and nothing could save us. You perceive that in crossing the Strom Channel, we always went a long way up above the whirl, even in the calmest weather, and then had to wait and watch carefully for the slack. But now we were driving right upon the pool itself, and in such a hurricane as this. To be sure, I thought, we shall get there just about the slack. There is some little hope in that. But the next moment I cursed myself for being so great a fool as to dream of hope at all. I knew very well we were doomed, had we been 10 times a 90-gun ship. By this time, the first fury of the tempest had spent itself. Or perhaps we did not feel it so much as we scuttled before it, but at all events the seas, which at first had been kept down by the wind, and lay flat and frothing, now got up into absolute mountains. A singular change, too, had come over the heavens. Around in every direction it was still as black as pitch, but nearly overhead there burst out, all at once, a circular rift of clear sky, as clear as I ever saw, and of a deep, bright blue. And through it there blazed forth the full moon with a luster as I never before knew her to wear. She lit up everything about us with the greatest distinctness, but, oh God, what a scene it was to light up. I now made 1 or 2 attempts to speak to my brother, but in a manner I couldn't understand. The din had so increased that I could not make him hear a single word, although I screamed at the top of my voice in his ear. Presently he shook his head, looking as pale as death, and held up one of his fingers as if to say, "Listen." At first I could not make out what he meant, but soon a hideous thought flashed upon me. I dragged my watch from its fob. It was not going. I glanced at its face by the moonlight and then burst into tears as I flung it away into the ocean. It had run down at 7 o'clock. We were behind the time of the slack, and the whirl of the Strom was in full fury. Could you screenshot that for me, just for posterity? When a boat is well built, properly trimmed, and not deep laden, the waves in a strong gale, when she is going large, seem always to slip from beneath her, which appears very strange to a landsman. And this is what we called riding, in sea phrase. Well, so far we had ridden the swells very cleverly, but presently a gigantic sea happened to take us right under the counter, and bore with us as it rose, up, up, as if into the sky. I would not have believed that any wave could rise so high, and then down we came with a sweep, a slide, and a plunge that made me feel sick and dizzy as if I was falling from some lofty mountain top in a dream. But while we were up, I had thrown a quick glance around, and that one glance was all sufficient. I saw our exact position in an instant. The Moskoe-Strom whirlpool was about 1/4 of a mile dead ahead, but no more like the everyday Moskoe-Strom than the whirl as you see it now, is like a mill race. If I had not known where we were and what to expect, I should not have recognized the place at all. As it was, I involuntarily closed my eyes in horror. The lids clenched themselves together as if in a spasm. It could not have been more than 2 minutes afterward until we suddenly felt the waves subside and we were enveloped in foam. The boat made a sharp half-turn to larboard and then shot off in its new direction like a thunderbolt. At the same moment, the roaring noise of the water was completely drowned in a kind of shrill shriek, such a sound as you might imagine given out by the waste pipes of many thousand steam vessels letting off their steam altogether. We were now in the belt of surf that always surrounds the whirl, and I thought, of course, that another moment would plunge us into the abyss, down which we could only see it indistinctly on account of the amazing velocity with which we were borne along. The boat did not seem to sink into the water at all, but to skim like an air bubble upon the surface of the surge. Her starboard side was next the whirl, and on the larboard arose the world of ocean we had left. It stood like a huge writhing wall between us and the horizon. It may appear strange, but now we were on the very jaws of the gulf. I felt more composed than when we were only approaching it. Having made up my mind to hope no more, I got rid of a great deal of terror which unmanned me at first. I suppose it was despair that strung my nerves. It may look like boasting, but what I tell you is truth. I began to reflect how magnificent a thing it was to die in such a manner, and how foolish it was in me to think so paltry a consideration as my own individual life, in view of so wonderful a manifestation of God's power. I do believe that I blushed with shame when this idea crossed my mind. After a little while, I became possessed with the keenest curiosity about the world itself. I positively felt a wish to explore its depths, even at the sacrifice I was going to make. And my principal grief was that I should never be able to tell my old companions on shore about the mysteries I should see. These, no doubt, were singular fancies to occupy a man's mind in such extremity, and I have often thought since that the revolutions of the boat around the pool might have rendered me a little light-headed. There was another circumstance which tended to restore my self-possession, and this was the cessation of the wind, which could not reach us in our present situation, for, as you saw yourself, the belt of surf is considerably lower than the general bed of the ocean, and this latter now towered above us, a high, black, mountainous ridge. If you have never been at sea in a heavy gale, you can form no idea of the confusion of mind occasioned by the wind and spray together. They blind, deafen, and strangle you, and take away all power of action or reflection. But we were now, in a great measure, rid of these annoyances, just as death-condemned felons in prison are allowed petty indulgences, forbidden them while their doom is yet uncertain. How often we made the circuit of the belt is impossible to say. We careered round and round for perhaps an hour, flying rather than floating, gradually getting more and more into the middle of the surge, and then nearer and nearer to its horrible inner edge. All this time I had never let go of the ring bolt. My brother was at the stern, holding on to an empty, small water cask, which had been securely lashed under the coop of the counters, and was the only thing on deck that had not been swept overboard when the gale first took us. As we approached the brink of the pit, he let go his hold upon this and made for the ring, from which, in the agony of his terror, he endeavored to force my hands, as it was not large enough to afford us both a secure grasp. I never felt a deeper grief than when I saw him attempt this act, although I knew he was a madman when he did it, a raving maniac through sheer fright. I did not care, however, to contest the point with him. I knew it could make no difference whether either of us held on at all, so I let him have the bolt and went astern to the cask. This there was no great difficulty in doing, for the smack flew round steadily enough and upon an even keel, only swaying to and fro with the immense sweeps and shelters of the whirl. Scarcely had I secured myself in my new position when we gave a wild lurch to starboard and rushed headlong into the abyss. I muttered a hurried prayer to God and thought all was over. As I felt the sickening sweep of the descent, I had instinctively tightened my hold upon the barrel and closed my eyes. For some seconds I dared not open them, while I expected instant destruction and wondered why I was not already in my death struggles with the water. But moment after moment elapsed. I still lived. The sense of falling had ceased, and the motion of the vessel seemed much as it had before, while in the belt of foam, with the exception that she now lay more along. I took courage and looked once again upon the scene. Never shall I forget the sensation of awe, horror, and admiration with which I gazed about me. The boat appeared to be hanging as if by magic, midway down, upon the interior surface of a funnel vast in circumference, prodigious in depth, and whose perfectly smooth sides might have been mistaken for ebony. But for the bewildering rapidity with which they spun around, and for the gleaming and ghastly radiance they shot forth, as the rays of the full moon from that circular rift amid the clouds I have already described, streamed in a flood of golden glory along the black walls and far away down to the innermost recesses of the abyss. At first, I was too much confused to observe anything accurately. The general burst of terrific grandeur was all that I beheld. When I recovered myself a little, however, my gaze fell instinctively downward. In this direction, I was able to obtain an unobstructed view from the manner in which the smack hung on the inclined surface of the pool. She was quite upon an even keel. That is to say, her deck lay in a plane parallel with that of the water, but this latter sloped at an angle of more than 45 degrees, so that we seemed to be lying on our beam ends. I could not help observing, nevertheless, that I scarcely had more difficulty in maintaining my hold and footing in this position than if we had been upon a dead level, and this, I suppose, was owing to the speed at which we revolved. The rays of the moon seemed to search the very bottom of the profound gulf, but still I could make out nothing distinctly on account of a thick mist which there hung, a magnificent rainbow, like that narrow and tottering bridge which Mussulmans say is the only path between time and eternity. This mist or spray was no doubt occasioned by the clashing of the great walls of the funnel as they all met at the bottom, but the yell that went up to the heavens from out that mist I dare not attempt to describe. Our first slide into the abyss itself from the belt of foam above had carried us a great distance down the slope, but our farther descent was by no means proportionate. Round and round we swept, not with any uniform movement, but in dizzying swings and jerks that sent us sometimes only a few hundred yards, sometimes nearly the complete circuit of the whirl. Our progress downwards at each revolution was slow but very perceptible. Looking about me upon the wide waste of liquid ebony on which we were thus borne, I perceived that our boat was not the only object in the embrace of the whirl. Both above and below us were visible fragments of vessels, large masses of building timber, and trunks of trees with many smaller articles, such as pieces of house furniture, broken boxes, barrels, and staves. I have already described the unnatural curiosity which had taken the place of my original terrors. It appeared to grow upon me as I drew nearer and nearer to my dreadful doom. I now began to watch with a strange interest the numerous things that floated in our company. I must have been delirious, for I even sought amusement in speculating upon the relative velocities of their several descents toward the foam below. This fir tree, I found myself at one time saying, will certainly be the next thing that takes the awful plunge and disappears. And then I found I was disappointed that the wreck of a Dutch merchant ship overtook it and went down before. At length, after making several guesses of this nature and being deceived in all, this fact, the fact of my invariable miscalculation, set me upon a train of reflection that made my limbs again tremble and my heart beat heavily once more. It was not a new terror that thus affected me, but the dawn of a more exciting hope. This hope arose partly from memory and partly from present observation. I called to mind the great variety of buoyant matter that strewed the coast of Lofoden, having been absorbed and then thrown forth by the Moskostrom. By far the greater number of the articles were shattered in the most extraordinary way, so chafed and roughened as to have the appearance of being struck full of splinters. But then I distinctly recollected that there were some of them which were not disfigured at all. Not only could I not account for this difference except by supposing that the roughened fragments were the only ones that had been completely absorbed, but the others had entered the whirl at so late a period of the tide, or for some reason had descended so slowly after entering, that they did not reach the bottom before the turn of the flood came, or of the ebb, as the case might be. I conceived it possible in either instance that they might thus be whirled up again to the level of the ocean without undergoing the fate of those which had been drawn in more early or absorbed more rapidly. I made also 3 important observations. The first was that, as a general rule, the larger bodies were, the more rapid their descent. The second that, between 2 masses of equal extent, the one spherical and the other of any other shape, the superiority in speed of descent was with the sphere. The third, that, between masses of equal size, the one cylindrical and the other of any other shape, the cylinder was absorbed the more slowly. Since my escape, I have had several conversations on this subject with an old schoolmaster of the district, and it was from him that I learned that the use of the words cylinder and sphere. He explained to me, although I have forgotten the explanation, how what I observed was in fact the natural consequence of the forms of the floating fragments, and showed me how it happened that a cylinder swimming in a vortex offered more resistance to its suction and was drawn in with greater difficulty than an equally bulky body of any form whatsoever. There is a note here. See Archimedes, De Incidentibus in Fluido, Library 2. There was one startling circumstance which went a great way in enforcing these observations and rendering me anxious to turn them to account, and this was that at every revolution we passed something like a barrel, or else the yard or the mast of a vessel, while many of these things, which had been on our level when I first opened my eyes upon the wonders of the whirlpool, were now higher up above us, and seemed to have moved but little from their original station. I no longer hesitated what to do. I resolved to lash myself securely to the water cask upon which I now held, to cut it loose from the counter, and to throw myself with it into the water. I attracted my brother's attention by signs, pointed to the floating barrels that came near us, and I did everything in my power to make him understand what I was about to do. I thought at length that he comprehended my design, but whether this was the case or not, he shook his head despairingly, and refused to move from his station by the ring-bolt. It was impossible to reach him, the emergency admitted of no delay, and so with a bitter struggle I resigned him to his fate, fastened myself to the cask by means of the lashing which secured it to the counter, and precipitated myself with it into the sea without another moment's hesitation. The result was precisely what I had hoped it would be. as it is myself who now tells you this tale, as you see that I did escape, and as you are already in possession of the mode in which this escape was effected, and must therefore anticipate all that I have farther to say, I will bring my story quickly to conclusion. It might have been an hour, or thereabout, after my quitting the smack when, having descended to a vast distance beneath me, it made 3 or 4 wild gyrations in rapid succession, and bearing my loved brother with it, plunged headlong at once and forever into the chaos of foam below. The barrel to which I was attached sunk very little farther than half the distance between the bottom of the gulf and the spot at which I had leapt overboard before a great change took place in the character of the whirlpool. The slope of the sides of the vast funnel became momently less and less steep. The gyrations of the whirl grew gradually less and less violent. By degrees, the froth and the rainbow disappeared, and the bottom of the gulf seemed slowly to uprise. The sky was clear, and the winds had gone down, and the full moon was setting radiantly in the west when I found myself on the surface of the ocean in full views of the shores of Lofoden, and above the spot where the pool of the Moskostrom had been. It was the hour of the slack, but the sea still heaved in mountainous waves from the effects of the hurricane. I was borne violently into the channel of the Strom, and in a few minutes was hurried down into the coast, into the grounds of the fishermen. A boat picked me up, exhausted from fatigue, and, now that the danger was removed, speechless from the memory of its horror. Those who drew me on board were my old mates and daily companions, but they knew me no more than they would have known a traveler from the spirit land. My hair, which had been raven black the day before, was as white as you see it now. They say, too, that the whole expression of my countenance had changed. I told them my story. They did not believe it. I tell it now to you, and I can scarcely expect you to put more faith in it than did the merry fishermen of Lofoden. I appreciate this was written back when it was taken for granted that you knew Latin. My Latin sucks. I'm not very good with Latin at all. Okay. Let me see how long this one is. Yes. A bit rusty yourself. I know what Latin I know is mostly nomenclature, and my brain just went blank. Organization of like kingdom, phylum, class. What the heck is it called? It's not taxonomy. Is it taxonomy? I don't know. My brain's blank after that. Okay. We're gonna do one more. There's like a pressure in my throat, like right next to my voice box, so I'm not gonna push it. But we can do one more. We can make it an hour. Any progress is good progress. We've actually hit the 400 page mark. Bear in mind that is 400 out of 1,020, but we've hit the 400 page mark. I am going to assume this is pronounced colloquy? Colloquy? Soliloquy. Colloquy. I'm going to say colloquy. Colloquy? I've actually not seen this word before, but that's what we're going to go with. It looks like, yes. So this is almost written in play format? Almost. So I will give you who is speaking because they give us who is speaking. And otherwise it might be very confusing. So, the colloquy of Monos and Una. It does start with a preface. I can't read the language that it is in, but it said that it is by Sophocles from Antig. And the translation is, "These things are in the future." Una. Born again. Monos. Yes, fairest and best beloved Una, born again. These were the words upon whose mystical meaning I had so long pondered, rejecting the explanations of the priesthood until death himself resolved me for the secret. Una. Death? Monos. How strangely sweet, Una. You echo my words. I observe, too, a vacillation in your step, a joyous inquietude in your eyes. You are confused and oppressed by the majestic novelty of the life eternal. Yes, it was of death I spoke. And hear how singularly sounds that word which of old was wont to bring terror to all hearts, throwing a mildew upon all pleasures. Una. Ah, death. The spectre which sates at all feasts. How often, Monos, did we lose ourselves in speculation upon its nature? How mysteriously did it act as a check to human bliss, saying unto it, thus far and no farther. That earnest mutual love, my own Monos, which burned within our bosoms, how vainly did we flatter ourselves, feeling happy in its first upspringing, that our happiness would strengthen with its strength. Alas, as it grew, so grew in our hearts the dread of that evil hour which was hurrying to separate us forever. Thus in time it became painful to love. Hate would have been a mercy then. Monos. Speak not here of those griefs, dear Una. Mine forever now. Una. But the memory of past sorrow, is it not present joy? I have much to say of the things which have been. Above all, I burn to know the incidents of your own passage through the dark valley and shadow. Monos. And when did the radiant Una ask anything of her Monos in vain? I will I will be minute in relating all, but at what point shall the weird narrative begin? At what point? You have said. Monos, I comprehend you. In death we have both learned the propensity of man to define the indefinable. I will not say, then, commence with the moment of life's cessation, but commence with that sad instant when the fever having abandoned you, you sank into a breathless and motionless torpor, and I pressed down your pallid eyelids with the passionate fingers of love. One word first, my Una, in regards to man's general condition at this epoch. You will remember that one or two of the wise among our forefathers, wise in fact, although not in the world's esteem, had ventured to doubt the propriety of the term improvement, as applied to the progress of our civilization. There were periods in each of the 5 or 6 centuries immediately preceding our dissolution, when arose some vigorous intellect boldly contending for those principles whose truth appear now, to our disenfranchised reason, so utterly obvious. Principles which should have taught our race to submit to the guidance of the natural laws rather than attempt their control. At long intervals, some masterminds appeared, looking upon each advance in practical science as a retrogradation in the true utility. Occasionally, the poetic intellect, that intellect which we now feel to have been the most exalted of all, since those truths which to us were of the most enduring importance could only be reached by that analogy which speaks in proof tones to the imagination alone, and to the unaided reason bears no weight. Occasionally did this poetic intellect proceed a step further in the evolving of the vague idea of the philosophic, and find in the mystic parable that tells of the tree of knowledge and of its forbidden fruit, death-producing, a distinct intimation that the knowledge was not meet for man in the infant condition of his soul. And these men, the poets, living and perishing amid the scorn of the utilitarians, of rough pedants, who arrogated themselves to a title which could have been properly applied only to the scorned. These men, the poets, pondered piningly, yet not unwisely, among the ancient days when our wants were not more simple than our enjoyments were keen. Days when mirth was a word unknown, so solemnly deep-toned was happiness. Holy, august, and blissful days when blue rivers ran undammed between hills unhewn, and far forest solitudes primeval, odorous, and unexplored. Sorry, I need more water. Yet these noble exceptions from the general misrule serve but to strengthen it by opposition. Alas, we had fallen upon the most evil of our evil days. The great movement, that was the cant term, went on, a diseased commotion, moral and physical. Art, the arts, arose supreme and once enthroned, cast chains upon the intellect which had elevated them to power. Man, because he could not but acknowledge the majesty of nature, fell into childish exultation at his acquired and still increasing dominion over her elements. Even while he stalked a god in his infancy, an infantine imbecility came over him. As might be supposed from the origin of his disorder, he grew infected with system and with abstraction. He enwrapped himself in generalities. Among other odd ideas, that of universal equality gained ground, and in the face of analogy and of God, in despite of the loudest warning voice of the laws of gradation, so visibly pervading all things in earth and heaven, wild attempts at an omniprevalent democracy were made. Yet this evil sprang necessarily from the leading evil, knowledge. Man could not both know and succumb. Meantime, huge smoking cities arose, innumerable. Green leaves shrank before the hot breath of furnaces. The fair face of nature was deformed as with the ravages of some loathsome disease. And methinks, sweet Una, even our slumbering sense of the forced and of the far-fetched might have arrested us here. But now it appears that we had worked out our own destruction in the perversion of our taste, or rather in the blind neglect of its culture in the schools, for in truth it was at this crisis that taste alone, that faculty which holding a middle position between the pure intellect and the moral sense, could never safely have been disregarded. It was now that taste alone could have led us gently back to beauty, to nature, and to life. But alas for the pure contemplative spirit and majestic intuition of Plato. Alas for the... I believe that's Russian that I don't know how to pronounce. Which he justly regarded it as an all-sufficient education for the soul. Alas for him and for it, since both were most desperately needed when both were most entirely forgotten and despised. Pascal, a philosopher whom we both love, has said how truly... Oh, sorry, I missed a note. So entirely forgotten and despised, there is a note. It will be hard to discover a better method of education than that which the experience of so many ages has already discovered, and this may be summed up as consisting in gymnastics for the body and music for the soul. Republican Library 2. For this reason is a musical education most essential, for it causes rhythm and harmony to penetrate most intimately into the soul, taking strongest hold upon it, filling it with beauty, and making the man beautiful-minded. He will praise and admire the beautiful, will receive it with joy into his soul, will feed upon it and assimilate his own condition with it. Had, however, among the Athenians a far more comprehensive signification than with us. That was an awkward phrasing, I'm sorry. It included not only the harmonies of time and of tune, but the poetic diction, sentiment, and creation, each within its widest sense. The study of music was with them, in fact, the general cultivation of the taste, of that which recognizes the beautiful, in contradistinction from reason, which deals only with the true. History, from that word previously that, again, I cannot pronounce, to contemplate. All right. Pascal, a philosopher whom we both love, has said how truly... I'm about to butcher some French, and I apologize. Que tout notre raisonnement se réduit à se dire au sentiment. And it is not impossible that the sentiment of the natural, had time permitted it, would have regained its old ascendancy over the harsh mathematical reason of the schools. But this thing was not to be. Prematurely induced by intemperance of knowledge, the old age of the world drew on. This the mass of mankind saw not, or living lustily, although unhappily, affected not to see. But for myself, the earth's records had taught me to look for widest ruin as the price of highest civilization. I had imbibed a prescience of our fate from comparison of China, the simple and enduring, with Assyria, the architect, with Egypt, the astrologer, with Nubia, more crafty than either, the turbulent mother of all arts. In history of these regions, I met with a ray from the future. The individual artificialities of the three latter were local diseases of the earth, and in their individual overthrows we had seen local remedies applied. But for the infected world at large I could not anticipate regeneration save in death. That man as a race should not become extinct, I saw that he must be born again. And now it was, fairest and dearest, that we wrapped our spirits daily in dreams. Now it was in twilight that we discoursed of the days to come, when the art-scarred surface of the earth having undergone that purification, which alone could efface its rectangular obscenities, should clothe itself anew in the verdure and the mountain slopes and the smiling waters of paradise, and be rendered at length a fit dwelling place for man the death purged, for man to whose now exalted intellect there should be poison and knowledge no more, for the redeemed, regenerated, blissful, and now immortal, but still for the material man. Una. Well do I remember these conversations, dear Monos, but the epoch of the fiery overthrow was not so near at hand as we believed, and as the corruption you indicate did surely warrant us in believing. Men lived and died individually. You yourself sickened and passed into the grave, and thither your constant Una speedily followed you. And though the century, which has since elapsed and whose conclusion brings us thus together once more, tortured our slumbering senses with no impatience of duration, yet, my Monos, it was a century still. Monos. Say, rather, a point in the vague infinity. Unquestionably, it was in the earth's dotage that I died. Wearied at heart with anxiety which had their origin in the general turmoil and decay, I succumbed to the fierce fever. After some few days of pain and many a dreamy delirium, replete with ecstasy, the manifestations of which you mistook for pain, while I longed was but impotent to undeceive you. After some days there came upon me, as you have said, a breathless and motionless torpor, and this was termed death by those who stood around me. Words are vague things. My condition did not deprive me of sentience. It appeared to me not greatly dissimilar to the extreme quiescence of him who, having slumbered long and profoundly, laying motionless and fully prostrate in a midsummer noon, begins to steal slowly back into consciousness, through the mere sufficiency of his sleep and without being awakened by external disturbances. I breathed no longer. The pulses were still. The heart had ceased to beat. Volition had not departed, but was powerless. The senses were unusually active, although eccentrically so, assuming often each other's functions at random. The taste and the smell were inextricably confounded, and became one sentiment, abnormal and intense. The rose water with which your tenderness had moistened my lips to the last affected me with sweet fancies of flowers. Fantastic flowers, far more lovely than any of the old earth, but whose prototypes we have here blooming around us. The eyelids, transparent and bloodless, offered no complete impediment to vision. As volition was in obeyance, the balls could not roll in their sockets, but all objects within the range of the visual hemisphere were seen with more or less distinctness. The rays which fell upon the external retina, or into the corner of the eye, producing a more vivid effect than those which struck the front or interior surface. Yet in the former instance, this effect was so far anomalous that I appreciated it only as sound. Sound, sweet or discordant as the matters presenting themselves at my side were light or dark in shade, curved or angular in outline. The hearing at the same time, although excited in degree, was not irregular in action, estimating real sounds with an extravagance of precision not less than of sensibility. Touch had undergone a modification more peculiar. Its impressions were tardily received, but pertinaciously retained, and resulted always in the highest physical pleasure. Thus the pressure of your sweet fingers upon my eyelids, at first only recognized through vision, at length, long after their removal, filled my whole being with a sensual delight immeasurable. I say with a sensual delight. All my perceptions were purely sensual. The materials furnished by the passive brain by the senses were not in the least degree wrought into shape by the deceased understanding. Of pain there was some little, of pleasure there was much, but of moral pain or pleasure none at all. Thus your wild sobs floated into my ear with all their mournful cadences, and were appreciated in their every variation of sad tone. But they were soft musical sounds, and no more. They conveyed to the extinct reason no imitation of the sorrows which gave them birth, while the large and constant tears which fell upon my face tell the bystanders of a heart which broke, thrilled every fibre of my frame with ecstasy alone. and this was in truth the death of which these bystanders spoke reverently in low whispers. You, sweet Una, gaspingly with loud cries. They attired me for the coffin, 3 or 4 dark figures which flitted busily to and fro. As these crossed the direct line of my vision, they affected me as forms, but upon passing to my side, their images impressed me with the idea of shrieks, groans, and of other dismal expressions of terror, of horror, or of woe. You, alone, habited in a white robe, passed in all directions musically about me. The day waned, and as its light faded away, I became possessed by a vague uneasiness, an anxiety such as the sleeper feels when sad, real sounds fall continuously within his ear. Low, distant bell tones, solemn at long but equal intervals, and commingling with melancholy dreams. Night arrived, and with its shadows a heavy discomfort. It oppressed my limbs with the oppression of some dull weight and was palpable. There was also a moaning sound, not unlike the distant reverberation of surf, but more continuous, which, beginning with the first twilight, had grown in strength with the darkness. Suddenly lights were brought into the room, and this reverberation became forthwith interrupted into frequent, unequal bursts of the same sound, but less dreary and less distinct. The ponderous oppression was in a great measure relieved, and issuing from the flame of each lamp, for there were many, there now flowed unbrokenly into my ears a strain of melodious monotone. And when now, dear Una, approaching the bed upon which I lay outstretched, you sat gently by my side, breathing odor from your sweet lips and pressing them upon my brow, there arose tremulously within my bosom, and mingling with the merely physical sensations which circumstances had called forth, a something akin to sentiment itself, a feeling that half appreciating, half responded to your earnest love and sorrow. But this feeling took no root in the pulseless heart, and seemed indeed rather a shadow than a reality, and faded quickly away, first into extreme quiescence, and then into a purely sensual pleasure as before. And now, from the wreck and chaos of the usual senses, there appeared to have arisen within me a sixth, all perfect. In its exercise I found a wild delight, yet a delight still physical, inasmuch as the understanding had in it no part. Motion in the animal frame had ceased fully. No muscle quivered, no nerve thrilled, no artery throbbed. But there seemed to have sprung up in the brain that of which no words can convey to the merely human intelligence even an indistinct conception. Let me term it a mental pendulous pulsation. It was the moral embodiment of man's abstract idea of time. But the absolute equalization of this movement, or of such as this, had the cycles of the firmamental orbs themselves been adjusted. By its aid, I measured the irregularities of the clock upon the mantel and of the watches of the attendants. Their tickings came sonorously into my ears, the slightest deviations from the true proportion, and these deviations were omniprevalent, affected me just as violations of abstract truth were wont, on earth, to affect the moral sense. Although no 2 of the timepieces in the chamber struck the individual seconds accurately together, yet I had no difficulty in holding steadily in mind the tones and the respective momentary airs of each. And this keen, perfect, self-existing sentiment of duration, this sentiment existing as man could not have possibly conceived it to exist, independently of any succession of events, this idea, this sixth sense, upspringing from the ashes of the rest, was the first obvious and certain step in the intemporal soul upon the threshold of the temporal eternity. It was midnight, and you still sat by my side. All others had departed from the chamber of death. They had deposited me in the coffin. The lamps burned flickeringly, for this I knew by the tremulousness of the monotonous strains. But suddenly these strains diminished in distinctness and in volume. Finally they ceased. The perfume in my nostrils died away. Forms affected my vision no longer. The oppression of the darkness uplifted itself from my bosom. A dull shock like that of electricity pervaded my frame and was followed by a total loss of the idea of contact. All of what man has termed sense was merged in the sole consciousness of eternity and in the one abiding sentiment of duration. The mortal body had been at length stricken with the hands of the deadly decay. Yet had not all sense of sentience departed, for the consciousness and the sentiment remaining supplied some of its functions by a lethargic intuition. I appreciated the direful change now in operation upon the flesh, and as the dreamer is sometimes aware of the bodily presence of one who leans over him, so, sweet Una, I still dully felt that you sat by my side. So too, when the noon of the second day came, I was not unconscious of those movements which displaced you from my side, which confined me within the coffin, which deposited me within the hearse, which bore me to the grave, which lowered me within it, which heaped heavily the mold upon me, and which thus left me in blackness and corruption to my sad and solemn slumbers with the worm. And here in the prison house, which has few secrets to disclose, there rolled away days and weeks and months, and the soul watched narrowly each second as it flew, and without effort took record of its flight, without effort and without object. A year passed. The consciousness of being had grown hourly more indistinct, and that of mere locality had in great measure usurped its position. The idea of entity was becoming merged in that of place. The narrow space immediately surrounding what had been the body was now growing to be the body itself. At length, as often happens to the sleeper, by sleep in its world alone is death imagined. At length, as sometimes happened on earth to the deep slumberer, when some flitting light half startled him into waking, yet left him half enveloped in dreams, so to me, in the strict embrace of the shadow, came that light which alone might have had the power to startle, the light of enduring love. Men toiled at the grave in which I lay darkling. They up through the damp earth, upon my mouldering bones, there descended the coffin of Una. And now again all was void. That nebulous light had been extinguished. That feeble thrill had vibrated itself into quiescence. Many lustra had supervened. Dust had returned to dust. The worm had food no more. The sense of being had at length utterly departed, and there reigned in its stead, instead of all things, dominant and perpetual, the autocrat's time and place. For that which was not, for that which had no form, for that which had no thought, for that which had no sentience, for that which was soulless, yet of which matter formed no position. For all this nothingness, yet for all this immortality, the grave was still a home, and the corrosive hours co-mates. Well, that wasn't depressing or horrific at all. I've had dreams. I have had dreams where I'm dead, and after I die, everything in the dream is just black until I wake up. But there is still like a sense of awareness of the passing of time that I can't explain. I don't know how many of you may have died in your dreams. I don't think it's actually something you should do. I don't believe you will die if you do die in your dreams, because obviously I'm still alive. But oh wow, I just like yeeted myself off screen. But yeah, that hit differently. I agree, Dr. Frederick, that one was different. You have dreams like that frequently. I don't think it's great to have dreams where you die frequently. I don't have them so much as I used to, probably because I'm not in the bad situations that I used to be. But there was one very interesting dream I had where I died. I was in a I think probably I'd seen a little bit too much of JFK, because I had a dream that I was in a convertible with my mom and I got shot. I don't think I was shot like the way that JFK was shot, but I was shot. And as everything kind of faded to black, a game over screen started to play. I don't remember exactly what it said, but I distinctly remember that there were words upon a screen indicating something about my death like you might see in a video game. Can't believe we hit 690 subs on an Edgar Allan Poe stream. Well, we didn't have the E word this time. We had other suggestive words. I agree about that comment about touch being pleasure. A weird aside, especially when I was already doing kind of like a mommy voice type thing. That's to make up for all the times that you'd never got to request it on Twitch because I moved to YouTube. Whoops. I just spilled water all over myself. It's fine. No E word. Yeah, I don't want to give the E word away to people who are new here. But okay, with that, I generally don't redirect after the Edgar Allan Poe streams, so we are going to call it a night there. I am going to rest my voice and hope for potentially a longer stream. My friend this week also wants to do some sort of like double movie feature type thing. He wants us to see Twisters, which is funny because that's honestly, I enjoy the movie Twister. I think it's cheesy in the most delightful way. And then possibly Deadpool. So I'll see what we end up doing. I will keep you updated. I'm at least going to try to do more Dark Souls this week. Whatever day that is possible, I will be playing Dark Souls because we are so close to the end. Oh no, JLW just missed it. There will be a VOD, but I am very sorry that you missed it live. But thank you for stopping in. I appreciate it. It's just, I screamed a little bit too much at an event I was at yesterday. Wonderful in a terribly ironic way. Hope you have a pleasant week, however it turns out. Yes, I am hoping I do not have to be there Tuesday, because if I'm not there Tuesday, we're probably just going to do like a Final Fantasy crafting stream or maybe some theater rhythm. It'll be really chill and low key and something that I don't have to worry about not getting back to. Just as we discussed in that stream that made you accidentally think that I was graduating, and I'm still sorry for that. I tried to word it in a way that wasn't terrifying and I failed. Okay. I hope you all have a wonderful week. I will see you when I see you. And yeah, have a wonderful night. Thank you for joining me. It still astonishes me how much you enjoy these streams, but I guess it's a wonderful way to start a week. Just nice and relaxed and chill. All right. Good night, everybody. Bye.